Africa is often associated with a rich antelope fauna, but deer farming, particularly for its meat and antlers, is a little-known phenomenon. Although deer are not native to the continent, recent initiatives are exploring their economic potential. What are the origins of this practice in Africa, and what challenges does it pose? Let's explore this topic in detail. Deer farming, well established in countries such as New Zealand, China, and the United States, is a rare practice in Africa, where cervids are not native south of the Sahara, with the exception of the Barbary deer, a subspecies of red deer found in the mountainous forests of North Africa, particularly in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Historically, this deer, also known as the Atlas deer, was hunted intensively, leading to its extinction in Morocco in the 19th century and a sharp decline in its populations elsewhere. Conservation efforts, such as the reintroduction in Morocco's Tzeka National Park, have led to a slight increase in its population, but it remains an endangered species, mainly protected in national parks. The introduction of other deer species into Africa, such as the European red deer or the white-tailed deer, is a more recent phenomenon, linked to colonial history and trade. As early as the 18th century, European powers, particularly the British, introduced deer into certain regions, such as South Africa, for symbolic and economic reasons. These introductions, often intended to create hunting reserves for the colonial elite, reflected a desire to impose a European model of wildlife management. For example, red deer were introduced to Barbuda in the Caribbean by the British in the 18th century, a precedent that illustrates the willingness of colonists to import familiar species for reasons of prestige or exploitation. Diplomatically, deer farming in Africa is part of a context of economic diversification and international cooperation. Since the 2000s, several African countries have sought to modernize their agriculture to reduce their dependence on food imports. Deer meat, or venison, is recognized for its low fat content and nutritional value, making it a potentially attractive product on local and international markets. Furthermore, deer antlers, particularly in the form of velvet, are prized in East Asia, where they are used in traditional Chinese medicine. This market, dominated by countries such as New Zealand and China, has attracted the interest of some African entrepreneurs, who are exploring partnerships with Asian players to develop this industry. In South Africa, for example, deer farming has been piloted through hunting ranches, where species such as red deer and axis deer have been introduced to meet the demand for hunting tourism. These ranches, often located in fenced areas, attract international hunters seeking trophies, a sector that generates significant revenue, as illustrated by the example of New Zealand, where the hunting industry brought in more than $20 million annually in the early 2000s. These initiatives rely on technological and commercial exchanges with countries with expertise in deer farming, such as Australia and Canada. However, the history of deer farming in Africa is also marked by environmental and social challenges. The introduction of non-native species has sometimes disrupted local ecosystems, as in South Africa, where deer escaped from ranches have become feral populations, outcompeting native species such as antelopes. These dynamics underscore the importance of careful management to balance economic objectives and biodiversity preservation. Although large-scale deer farming is not yet widespread in Africa, recent initiatives suggest growing interest in the sector. In South Africa, private ranches have expanded deer farming, particularly red and axis deer, to meet demand for venison and velvet antlers. These ranches, often located in provinces such as the Eastern Cape and Limpopo, are modeled after foreign models, such as those in New Zealand, where the deer industry generates venison exports worth more than $260 million annually. South African ranches primarily target the trophy hunting market, but some are also exploring meat production for high-end restaurants and export markets to Europe and Asia. In 2024, reports indicated that Chinese investors entered into discussions with South African partners to develop deer antler processing infrastructure, including for the production of velvet for traditional medicine. These discussions, while preliminary, come amid growing cooperation between China and several African countries under the Belt and Road Initiative. For example, agreements signed in 2023 between China and South Africa included components on agricultural cooperation, although specific details on deer farming remain limited. In North Africa, Barbary deer conservation efforts continue, with projects supported by international organizations such as the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. In Tunisia, Fadja National Park has reported an increase in the Barbary deer population by 2024, thanks to enhanced protection measures. These initiatives, while focused on conservation rather than commercial exploitation, could serve as a basis for pilot sustainable breeding programs in the region. Elsewhere on the continent, experimental projects have been reported in countries such as Kenya and Namibia, where entrepreneurs are exploring deer farming to diversify sources of animal protein. These initiatives remain small-scale and face regulatory constraints, particularly due to strict laws on the introduction of non-native species. For example, in Namibia, authorities require special permits for deer farming to prevent the ecological impacts observed with other introduced species, such as the red deer in South Africa. Technologically, advances in antler processing have been observed. Modern factories, inspired by Chinese facilities where millions of deer are raised for their antlers and meat, are beginning to appear in parts of South Africa. These factories, although few in number, use techniques such as cutting under anesthesia to harvest velvet, in accordance with international animal welfare standards. These developments draw on expertise from abroad, particularly Australia, where deer farming is regulated to ensure ethical practices. The emergence of deer farming in Africa raises several economic, environmental, and social challenges. Economically, this industry offers opportunities to diversify agricultural incomes in countries where traditional livestock farming, such as cattle, faces climatic and economic challenges. Venison, with its low-fat content and appeal to health-conscious consumers, could find a market in African urban centers and internationally. Moreover, the trade in deer antlers, particularly in the form of velvet, represents a lucrative opportunity, given the high demand in Asia, where products such as antler-derived pantocrine are used for their purported medicinal properties. However, the economic challenges are significant. Deer farming requires significant infrastructure investments, such as high-security fencing and processing facilities that meet health standards. These costs can be prohibitive for small farmers, limiting access to the industry to large companies or foreign investors. Furthermore, the volatility of deer product prices, as observed in New Zealand between 2002 and 2006, where overproduction caused revenues to plummet, suggests that the market can be unstable. Environmentally, the introduction of non-native deer poses risks to biodiversity. In South Africa, for example, feral deer populations have competed with native antelopes for resources, disrupting local ecosystems. These impacts require careful management, including environmental impact assessments before any large-scale introduction. Furthermore, intensive deer farming can increase pressure on water resources and pastures in regions already affected by desertification. Socially, deer farming can create jobs, particularly in rural areas where economic opportunities are limited. However, combining this practice with hunting ranches for international clients raises ethical questions. In some contexts, such as 18th-century Barbuda, deer were reserved for the elite, excluding local populations from their benefits. Today, an inclusive approach involving local communities in the management and economic benefits is essential to ensure the social acceptance of these projects. Finally, international partnerships, particularly with China, highlight the importance of cooperation in developing this industry. However, these collaborations must be balanced to avoid overdependence on foreign markets or unequal exploitation of African resources. Animal welfare regulations, inspired by Australian and New Zealand standards, will also be crucial to meet the expectations of international consumers and animal protection organizations. Deer farming in Africa, while still marginal, reflects a desire to diversify the agricultural economy and explore new markets. Between economic opportunities and environmental challenges, this nascent industry raises complex questions. Only time will tell how it will integrate into the African agricultural landscape and influence regional dynamics.